גבירותיי ורבותיי, אנחנו נתחיל את המושב השלישי ונקווה שכולם ייכנסו מבחוץ. קשה להתחרות עם אוכל. אני רק רוצה להציג את היושבת ראש האחרונה.
I'd like to introduce Shiri Lev-Ari, who is the chair of our final session. Tell him to do something about it, okay? And the microphone is not loud enough. A journalist in Haaretz. In recent years, she's been a journalist with Kon Israel that is now called Kan, editor and presenter on Reshet Dalet, Reshet Bet, on literary programs. As of 2017, she concentrates on culture, literature, and so forth. Good evening. Thank you, Professor Golinkin. This final session in today's important conference is devoted to Jewish literature in the US and Jewish literature here in Israel. Maybe we'll be able to challenge our speakers and ask them to define what exactly is Jewish literature and what is a Jewish author. These are twins, U.S. Jewish literature and Israeli Jewish literature, twins. And whenever we talk about siblings, we have close ties and affection on the one hand, and tensions, rivalry, criticism, anger, love and anger. In this session, we have scholars and an author who will all be shedding light on the various aspects of Jewish literature here in Israel and in the US. The author Yochi Brandes is here, Dr. Levi Paz, Professor Roskis, and Professor Kramer. Each of the speakers will give introductory remarks and then we'll hold a panel discussion. Jewish literature in the US, at least from an Israeli perspective, is sometimes called, what I seem to feel is the road not taken. Some Jews came here and others immigrated to the US. And again, this is the Israeli perspective. That was the other road. When we talk about Bashevis Singer, Saul Bellow, Malamud, and their the next literary generation, and we'll be hearing more about that. 4 days before his death, in May 1916, Shalom Aleichem, in New York, he was ill. And in Yiddish, he wrote the last chapters of Motil Ben Pesi Chazan, a novel in the Yiddish tradition, very funny and sad novel describing the life in Eastern Europe and the immigration process to the land of endless opportunity, the Golden Medina. He did this by using Yiddish. 20 years later, Bashevis Singer immigrated from Warsaw to the US, came with his brother, and they wrote and edited the foreword. Bashevis took his mother's name, Batsheva was his mother. He took her last name. His music is the Yiddish shtetl style. Then Bernard Malamud, he was born in the US already, in Brooklyn, son of Jewish immigrants from Russia. The Helper and other of his works describe the shtetl and the immigrants from Eastern Europe living on the East Coast. Saul Bellow inaugurates a more complex relationship, and he was here in Israel twice. Also, the son of immigrants, though he was born in the States, he came to Israel in 1967 and he wrote about the 67-day war for a newspaper there. And then again, he came as a guest of Teddy Kollek. He wrote a book, a documentary, to Jerusalem and back about his visit here in Israel, describing his encounters with public figures and with all kinds of key figures in Israeli society at the time. He wrote about the need to bridge the gap between Jews and Arabs. He gave his opinions about the conflict and explained why peace is necessary for the region. Before I call upon the distinguished speakers, I'd like to share a thought with you. Often in Israeli literature, the early years, when we talk about the early years, 1948, and right afterwards, for decades, we talk about secular literature. Literature that didn't really echo Jewish tradition. But that isn't strictly true. Pinchas de Shamir, Hanoch Bartov did describe encounters with Holocaust survivors. They did relate to the Jewish world of Europe after it was destroyed. But if you take a general look at Israeli literature, fiction, it addresses topical local issues. Parallel to this, there was an ironic view, some sort of conflict between two models. The new Jew is prevalent, the Sabra Eli Sheba Min Hayam, that is from Moshe Shamir, the muscular, tanned Eli, the kibbutznik, the moshavnik. This is the new Jew. The opposite is the European, studious, bespectacled, weak, fragile Jew. And it's ironic to see that the same thing happened in Saul Bellows' writing. He gave the male Jew the success, the business success, and then the immigrant from Eastern Europe who just got off the boat, an intellectual, more delicate character. The types were in conflict. The new Jew in the American version, at least according to Saul Bellows' version of it, is a capitalist Jew bent on success. His role models are the cheap movie moguls and the cheap opera house successes. The American new Jew is able to save his brother, not his biological brother, that is to save the weak Holocaust survivor. And when the survivor wants contact, this is Billy in Saul Bellows' work. It's two completely different worlds and no connection is possible between them. This very deep infrastructure for the new Jew was a result of the wave of immigration from Eastern Europe. They came to a new place, whether Israel or America, and this is why the new Jew was necessary. Here in Israel, Moshe Shamir, he walked in the fields, is one of the defining literary works of Israeli literature. Uri, the Sabra, the kibbutznik, the first boy born in the kibbutz, and the tragic plot that unfolds during the War of Independence. He falls in love with a Holocaust survivor, and this becomes an impossible love story. If you haven't read the book, I'm sorry if this is a spoiler. This love affair between the beautiful Holocaust survivor from Poland who has nightmares at night and she has such a hard time in kibbutz society. This was the defining Israeli novel. To this day, Israeli authors, excuse me, Israeli authors relate to this character, Uri the Sabra, and his love for the Holocaust survivor. This is the model that served as the basis for both literatures. Philip Roth and others will hear about that. My life with Philip Roth is his work, and we'll hear about that. Professor Roskis will tell us about the miracles involved in bringing Yiddish back to life here in Israel in 2019. Yochi Brandes will tell of her writing on Jewish themes in secular Israeli fiction and her recent novel set in the Hasidic world. And Dr. Gitit Levi Paz will be talking about younger writers. Maybe they're not so young anymore, some have grown up. They won't see this side of 50. We're talking about Philip Roth's generation. If we make some sort of generational map, he's also the all-American writer. He died just about a year ago. I remember there were articles calling him a Jewish writer, an American writer. He was both, of course. Philip Roth. Michael Chabon and his wife, his Israeli wife, is also a writer. They're liked here in Israel. They edited a book about 50 years of occupation with writers from all over the world participating. They were here in Israel. They traveled in the West Bank. They're very involved. Nathan Englander, Nicole Krauss, Jonathan Safran Foer, and many, many more. These younger writers visited Israel. They're aware of Israel. They relate in their writing to Israel quite a bit. So this tie between the twins, this tie that used to be just thematic and implicit has become more explicit in recent years. Some recent novels actually address directly the question, what would have happened had the State of Israel not be established? What would happen if an American Jew came to enlist in the IDF? These are very acute questions. It is my privilege to call upon Professor Roskis to talk about miracles in Yiddish culture in Israel. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, every day I give thanks for 3 miracles: that I was born in a Yiddish-speaking home, in a multilingual surrounding where Yiddish was a living language. I went to school where we learned in Yiddish. This miracle happened during a total change in the Yiddish map. The periphery became the center, and the Iron Curtain fell. Though Yiddish has been diminishing, it is still important. It was clear to us that a rupture took place in Yiddish culture, demographic, geographic, ideological, personal. I learned Yiddish at a very early age, and I learned how to cope with loss. Stories written after the Holocaust grappled with issues of identity. This was a bridge over the chasm. Yiddish culture taught me how to face evil. The second miracle I give thanks for each and every day is that right after I left home, I was lucky enough to reach the right place, be there at the right time. In 1975, I was 27 years old. I joined the JTS faculty. Gershon Cohen, the chancellor of the JTS at the time, gave me a challenging task. He told me, introduce Yiddish studies into the rabbinical studies and the academic studies. The young faculty members in the Talmud, Jewish literature, Jewish thought, Jewish philosophy, Jewish history, Jewish language and literature, and all the other departments, all these younger faculty members were graduates or former students of Cohen himself, except for me. Moreover, in honor of my arrival, they changed the name of the department from Hebrew literature to Department of Jewish Literature. So overnight, a new academic discipline was born, the study of Jewish literature in all its languages. Yiddish literature gave me a new home, and I was able to inject content into the miracle. This all happened at the right time. The 70s were a period of soul searching, looking for roots. A new generation of Jews came of age at that time. The three pillars of American Jewry began with the letter H: humor, Holocaust, and Chavurah. H's. Jewish humor. In 77, Zero Mostel, the veteran comedian, died. He was the protagonist, Tevya, the milkman in The Fiddler on the Roof. And after him came Mel Brooks and Woody Allen. Then Holocaust. In 77, the defining article was published, Heirs of the Holocaust, by Helen Epstein in the New York Times Magazine. 2 years later, her book was published, Children of the Holocaust, Conversations with Sons of and Daughters of Survivors, that had a resounding impact and brought the whole second generation issue into the public conversation. Chavurah. In 73, the first volume of the Jewish catalog was published, the Do-It-Yourself Kit, the Shulchan Aruch of the Chavurah movement and the counterculture in Jewish society in America. What a rich array, unparalleled since the 20s. Then feminism came in the 70s. Lilith, the magazine, was published in the 70s. Popular grassroots music from Eastern Europe. Then in 78, young musicians formed a band. Then in Boston, the Klezmer Conservatory Band started to perform, and they sought their inspiration from the Yiddish theater in America. All this is something that I had to relate to as a student, as a scholar, as a teacher, as a citizen in the Jewish Republic. But even though there were miracles, there were difficulties too. What do you do when the first miracle conflicts with the second miracle? What do you do if you find yourself in a reality where the insights, the myths, the foundation is totally different from your own? Humor in America is based on a Yiddish accent, on curses and dirty talk, on hating the Gentiles, on self-hate. All this was totally foreign to me. Yiddish never made me laugh, Yiddish in itself. Chutzpah that I knew was chutzpah directed towards God. Yiddish is the language that God loves to talk. Yiddish was the best antidote against self-hate. Holocaust, der dritte Churban, the destruction of the third temple. In Yiddish, the Holocaust was a daily part of the news broadcasts. Eli Wiesel wrote Yiddish when he started out. He was one of many who became writers. He wasn't the prophet of doom. as far as we were concerned. There were greater prophets. Of these three H's, I felt closest to the Chavurah movement. I went to Chavurat Shalom and they called me the Homo Davenis. We prayed with an Ashkenazi accent. I wasn't familiar with that beforehand, except from Yiddish literature. We learned the Nigunim. I learned about Hasidism and Braslav with Art Green, who studied at the JTS. And that's where I restored Yiddish to its former glory. The Rebbe of Kotsk's song became the anthem of our Chavurah. But I never became a neo-Chassid. I'm a Lamed Tet, Litvak, Tahor, a pure Litvak, and I can't betray my Litvak heritage. Shimshon Dunsky was my teacher. The second miracle, coming to the JTS in mid-70s, conflicted with the first miracle, growing up in a Yiddish-speaking world, a world that laughed, cursed, grieved, and laughed all in Yiddish. Though it was all for the best, due to the JTS academic track and the rabbinical track, I found a way of teaching and studying. I meant originally to devote myself to scholarship, but it turns out that the 25 years I devoted to training rabbis were the most productive in my life, rabbis, men and women. It turns out that the best students are those who rediscover Judaism, and they are the most trusted to be trusted with the Chavurah. But these students knew nothing about Yiddish. They heard maybe a snatch of Yiddish songs or jokes. I didn't want to teach about the shtetl. I didn't want to teach them to miss the shtetl. Besides writing sermons, maybe it was a good idea for a rabbi to be able to tell a story. And it turned out that the focus of the core course on Jewish literature for rabbinical students had to be focused on narrative, on telling a story, on the art of the narrative. In the tradition of the great storytellers, I brought up my students, Peretz, Shalom Aleichem, Manger, Bashevis, Sutzkever. In the Semicha ceremony, the dean will call out, Rabbi will be your title, and storyteller will be your title too. This is how I dreamt of giving Yiddish literature its former glory. Baruch Hashem, there are still miracles. In 2007, when I was teaching on the summer program at Tel Aviv University, Moshe Yusman, the Dean of Humanities and Social Studies at Ben Gurion University, called me. He asked me if I knew any candidates for opening a Yiddish school in the university in the Negev. Next time we spoke, I gave him my own candidacy. The word is too difficult to say in Hebrew, but you know what I'm saying. My candidacy. I nominated myself. In our third conversation, this was already in person, we talked about the program itself, and I started teaching a semester every year here in Israel, first in Ben Gurion University, and in the next 7 years at the Hebrew University. What happens when the third miracle conflicts with the first miracle and with the second miracle? Ethnic, political, and religious reality here in Israel made for a completely different situation with different insights and suppositions, different myths. What can Yiddish literature and culture have to say for itself in such an extreme world that is so different from what I knew in Montreal and New York, where I grew up? The ethnic expanse was divided sharply between Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews. This was true even for humor. The Gashash Achiver and Jigar and Schumacher of blessed memory on the other side. Yiddish culture went along with Ladino. Just as Ladino was permitted, Yiddish could be permitted. And they were devoted to preserving the culture and language, each separately. In Ben Gurion University, I was a professor in the Department of Jewish Literature. It didn't work out so well. Putting Jewish and Ladino together led to the neutralizing and belittling of Ladino, trying to force it into some sort of diaspora folklore relic. What we tried to do at the JTS, we tried to put Jewish literature at the center of our syllabus, but that wasn't possible here. Yigal Schwartz, the head of the Department of Hebrew Literature at Ben Gurion University, he put out a brilliant book entitled The Ashkenazi Jews, Center versus Periphery, as if there had never been any Yiddish literature. Finally, we established an inter-university track with cooperation of Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion, and the Hebrew universities. In the current academic conditions in Israel, Yiddish has to fend for itself. Let's let our students a range of opportunities to implement their Yiddish in their intellectual world. Yiddish was divided, culture was divided between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. The divide widened between right and left. The Black Panthers had a slogan, Golda, speak Yiddish when you talk to us. That's still true today. Less Yiddish was heard after the Likud came to power. The Holocaust is another victim of power play in Israeli politics. The religious expanse is also divided in two between religious and secular. All the more so since in the Haredi religious expanse, Yiddish is spoken. In America, you can sometimes miss the Yiddish of the shtetl, the Lower East Side, since it doesn't exist anymore. But in Bnei Brak, Yiddish is alive. In Mea Shearim, in Geula, they speak Yiddish. And eventually they will be partners in the government coalition. It turns out that in the divided religious expanse, there is reconciliation and bridging of the gaps. A few decades late, the Chavura and American Jewish counterculture has finally made an impact on religious life in Israel. It is my opinion that they gave rise to the egalitarian and secular minyanim that are developing here in Israel, as Tova Hartman pointed out before. She spoke about that before. And their impact on the media in Israel, television and cinema, a way has been found to bridge the gaps, thanks to Yiddish. I'm talking about Shtisel, the series available on Netflix, the dystopic series Autonomies, and other attempts to give dramatic expression to the Haredi experience. To produce these and to act on them, the actors had to know Yiddish. That's part of the game. Just as a British actor playing Shakespeare has to speak iambic pentameter, any Israeli actor who wants to be on Israeli television has to learn Yiddish. Who knows, maybe one day the devoted actors will learn Yiddish literature, study Yiddish literature at the university. Recently, we've hit upon a virtual way to bridge the gaps in the political, ethnic, religious Israeli scene. A very innovative way. So we handed it on to our students. We launched a website devoted to the study of Yiddish language and literature, translation from Yiddish, Yiddish popular culture, and we called it Ingeweb, in the web. The name of the modernist poetry volume that Yoash put out in the 20s that echoes the word website. Website, a website. Tonight, you can check out this website. Look at ingeveb.com, ingeveb.com, and you'll find a wealth of material there. Translations and articles about religion, Chassidut, Kabbalah, and Yiddish culture. And I have to mention that we have members of our board here in Israel as well. Yiddish has been miraculous in my life, many miracles, one after the other. But there was no continuity, there's no causal relationship, no organizing principle. Nothing had anything to do with anything else. I tried for the first time for today's conference to present everything with some sort of order. Yiddish is on the margin of mainstream English-speaking Jewish culture and Hebrew-speaking Israeli culture. Therefore, Yiddish has to find ways of circumventing and finding inroads towards the center. Yiddish has no place in a world of extremes, but it certainly has a place, and an important one too, in a world where the number 3 is important. על הניסים, על הפורקן, על הגבורות, על התשועות, על הנחמות ועל המלחמות שעשית עמדי בימים ההם בזמן הזה. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor David Roskis. The Yiddish Literature Association, in a book by Michael Deben, has an imagined world of a Jewish country in Alaska, assuming that his assumption was that in 1948 the Arabs won, a Jewish state was not established in Israel, but rather there are Jewish policemen. Shoiber is a gun, and a shoifer is a cell phone, and Shamash is a police officer. So I'm sure we will hear about that and more from Dr. Gitit Levi-Paz. Thank you very much. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My interest in this conference on the topic of what Jewish identity in the United States and Israel is based on my assumptions, based on my work on contemporary Jewish identity. My doctorate, which I was privileged to write with the very devoted supervision of Michael Michael Kramer, who's here with us. I wrote about contemporary American Jewish literature, about the young authors, even though most of them are over 40, but in literature you have the benefit of being considered young even once you're 40 and over. So they're still considered young. Michael Shaban, Krauss, Jonathan van Foyer, who I'll talk more about today, Nathan Enlinger, who published yesterday a new novel called Kaddish.com, which is very interesting. And I asked what each of these novels has to say about Jewish identity and how it relates to Jewish issues that concerns researchers of Jewish identity and Jewish literature. As I'm sure you know, one of the main parameters for assessing Jewish identity today is Israel and the attitude towards Israel. And identity scholars ask questions based on these type of this affiliation with Israel. How many times did you visit Israel? What ties do you have with Israel? How much do you know about Israel, and how much are you involved in what happens in Israel? And it's very interesting when you look at the literature because, and this is the topic of my lecture today, Israel has very heavy presence in American Jewish literature. So we will hear about how Israel is represented in this literature and this genre, and what it says about the issue of Jewish identity, and what it says from the literary perspective. If we're talking about a generational context, what are the differences between contemporary literature in relation to Israel and what was written in the past? I want to mention 2 points that are especially interesting regarding the attitude towards Israel and so in sociology on the one hand and literature on the other. First of all, regarding literature, we see a renaissance in contemporary American Jewish writing. We see that Jewish authors write more and more about Israel. They are familiar with Israel. The plots of their novels occur in Israel. Many of their characters are Israeli. It's almost a Israeli renaissance in contemporary Jewish literature. In the United States, the most recent novel by Nicole Krauss, by Nathan Enlinger, the last novel by Jonathan van Foyer. All of these novels take place in Israel or are related to Israel in a very surprising way. You read the novel and it seems like you're reading an Israeli novel, not an American one. Their familiarity and their very intimate, close style. On the other hand, when we address the sociological perspective and consider the parameter of the attitude towards Israel in sociology among identity scholars, we see something slightly different. There we see that the dominant discourse is distancing. We see the distancing discourse with regard to Israel. And researchers talk about distancing from Israel among the young contemporary generation. And again, there are different variations. Since I didn't participate in the previous sessions, I'm sure you talked about Beinart, who talked a lot about the distancing from Israel, that talked about the alienation. He says very harsh things, especially to Israelis. He has a lot of very harsh things to say about the emotions that Israel and Israelism evokes in him, and he presents a very harsh picture of distancing. I think the image that he gave of 2 players that jump into the water and each one swims into a different direction. It's an encounter, confrontation, followed by distancing. Stephen Cohen, for example, talks also about distancing, a distancing discourse, but explains it as a general reduction of Jewish identity that is underway today. And as part of this reduction, Israel is less interesting to the American Jews. So in general, there is overall empathy towards Jewish identity among American youth. So there's lack of involvement, lack of interest, and lack of involvement. Of course, there is a gap here, a paradox, because we see literature that celebrates Israel on the one hand, and a sociological discourse that talks about alienation and distancing. So the question is, what is actually happening here? First of all, you can't have to worry. Sociology, there are voices in sociology that correspond with what we see in the literature, even though it's less prominent. And it's interesting to understand why those opinions are less prominent. But I want to begin with this paradox and talk about this gap between these two worlds, the sociology and the literary approach, and talk about the image that the literature gives us about the identity, about Israel as part of the Jewish identity of American Jews. I think it goes beyond the distancing discourse. What does that mean? What does it mean by beyond? That means that the distance discourse exists in literature. However, we take it one step further and moving beyond that distancing to explore other perspectives. There's criticism and there's some certain hesitance, but there's also intimacy and closeness and a very deep connection that we see. And there's a complexity here. Literature overall can contain that complexity, which is why I enjoy these novels very much. And this complexity is somewhat ambivalent. There's an emotional aspect that is quite complex with regard to Israel, with regard to Israelis, and Israeli culture in general. I want to explain a little bit what I mean by that. What is that beyond, and how do we encounter that beyond distancing element in the various novels? I'm not sure I'll have the time to talk about all the different novels, because quite a few have been written lately. I will try to focus on the novel by von Feuer, and if we have time, we'll talk about the novel by Nicole Krauss. Saf von Feuer wrote a novel in 2016 called Hineni, Here I Am, and it talks about a Jewish family, the Bloch family, a family of European origin. After the Holocaust, most of the family perished and only two brothers survived. One brother moved to Israel and the other brother emigrated to the United States. This happened in many families. And each established a family in their new homes. There's a certain degree of contention and tension between the two branches of the family that are based on the criticism, on that tension that exists between U.S. and Israeli Jews. But overall, they have a family relationship. They're in touch. They visit one another. And since it's a Jewish family that survived the Holocaust, it's a very small family. The connection between them is substantial. The plot focuses on the third generation of this family. The protagonist is Jacob Bloch, third generation, the grandson of the man who immigrated to Israel. He's a father himself. He's a playwright that's somewhat frustrated but very talented. And the novel focuses on his family through two parallel plots. There's a U.S. plot that describes what happens to Jacob and the collapse of his private Jewish home, his divorce, and everything that he experiences following this divorce. And we have to keep in mind that this process, this divorce, the bar mitzvah celebration for his oldest son, it's a very quick series of events that are connected to a type of betrayal. It's a form of betrayal. I don't want to say exactly what it is. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it. It's quite complex, as the author does so well, and it ends up tearing the family apart. In the Israeli plot, another home collapses. The national homeland is destroyed. There's a very severe earthquake. There's a very severe earthquake that causes severe damage to Israel. A horrible war follows, and hunger, and the entire Islamic world attacks Israel following the chaos of that earthquake, and Israel is experiencing an existential threat. And through this entire chaotic plot, in honor of the bar mitzvah of Jacob's oldest son, Jacob's cousin, Tamir Bloch, comes to visit. And as soon as he lands, the war breaks out, and he, of course, wants to go home, but he gets stuck there for a few days. And there are different events that happen that enhance the tension between the American Jew from Washington and the Israeli family member, Tamir from Haifa. And the story goes on from here. What's interesting is that when this novel was published in Israel, I read the criticism. Several critics claimed that the main story is a distancing discourse. Someone wrote, following up on Stephen Cohen and Beinhart, and similar to the distancing concept in sociology, they identified the novel as something that describes the confrontation between the two communities and how they distance themselves from one another. Asaf von Feuer describes Tamir, the Israeli character, the cousin, as a stereotypical, superficial macho Israeli, the writing was described as being superficial and not describing Israel correctly. That's the sense from that came from that book, the distancing between the two communities. Now, as you must understand, I don't accept this interpretation. I don't think that it's right to read the novel as one that reflects distancing. I think that it goes beyond distancing. And I think that it is much more complex and ambivalent than that. So I want to try to demonstrate briefly how I see this complexity and how we can see it in this specific novel. Regarding the stereotypical description, this superficiality of the cousin, the Israeli cousin, you have to realize, you talked about Jewish humor. Israeli Jewish literature also has that Jewish humor. And Feuer, if you're familiar with his style, he goes in that direction of humorous writing. This stereotypical superficiality is part of his humoristic style. In any case, there's no new distancing happening here. This distancing, by describing the Israeli as macho, is wrong from the historical perspective, because the image of the Israeli macho has existed in American discourse for 70 years. We can see the macho imagery in Hollywood. It began with Hollywood, and in literature, it's a very old and old-fashioned image. And Feuer is kind of mocking that in a humorous manner, taking it to the point of absurd. It's not something that it's not an element that he used to describe distancing. There's also a certain degree of irony that he's trying to express here. And the peak of the irony is the claims that are made by Jacob and by Tamar as his rudeness. But what tears apart Jacob's family in this story is how rude is his audacity, his vulgarity that causes his family to collapse. So there is irony and there's absurdity and there's a humorous tone to this book. And beyond that, the stereotypical writing is almost completely symmetrical, and because the American Jew is also described in very stereotypical manner. And Jacob, Foyer describes Jacob in an absurd manner and mocks the character of the progressive liberal American Jew, the intellectual who talks and talks, and one of the most outstanding characteristics is the fact that he doesn't stop talking. It's taking the stereotypical liberal American Jew and mocking it as well. And I think that he's even more critical of the American Jew than the Israeli Jew. So this Israeli criticism, in my opinion, is wrong. And it is not what reflects distancing in this novel. We also have to keep in mind that ultimately in the novel, the Jewish homeland survives. Tamar is in Israel. If you fight, I'm sorry if this is a spoiler. Israel survives, unlike the private home that ends up falling apart. So if there's any type of conflict here between speech and action, I would say that the action is the one that wins. Also, the novel has to be read by feeling the intimacy of how it's written. Israel is described in such an intimate, close way. And there's a very deep familiarity with Israelis and Israeli culture and society, locations in Israel. You can see the geographical writing. It's very authentic. And the sense that comes from the novel is that it feels like it's almost an Israeli novel. An Israeli-style novel doesn't correspond with distancing. On the contrary, it's actually very close. In the context of the complexity, it's true that this novel has a lot of criticism of Israel and Israeli society and Israeli culture, but the novel also emphasizes Jewish history, and through history justifies the Zionist establishment of a Jewish homeland. I think that in the Zionist discourse, the initial justification for establishing a Jewish homeland, establishing the state of Israel, is related to being a shelter for the Jewish people. And this discourse is very dominant in the novel. The Holocaust is in the background and at the center. This war for existence, anti-Semitism that comes up there. There's a sense that the Jewish shelter is still necessary, it's still vital. And it's a Zionist discourse that legitimizes the Jewish homeland. And it's very distant from the alienation that Beinart talks about, meaning that we no longer identify with the Jewish homeland because of all the political criticism against it. And that's also something that demonstrates the complexity, the ambivalence, its criticism combined with the necessity of a Jewish homeland. There's another important point is the virtual dimension of this novel. There is virtual communication. The sons of these cousins, Jacob and Tamar's children, are playing a computer game, and they have used very modern communication. They use the internet. It's an online game. It's very virtual. And on the one hand, you can read this as criticism, a relationship that's indirect For my generation and previous generations, it's hard to understand, hard to comprehend this type of communication, how family relations can be maintained in this manner. However, the novel ends with a virtual jester that's based on the computer game that's associated with the internet, and it connects the fourth generation, the cousins, Noam and Sam, the American cousins. And this very authentic connection that ends the novel demonstrates the complexity again, because on the one hand, it's a virtual, weak relationship. It's not strong enough. It could end at any moment. It's very fragile, these identities and these relationships. However, this gesture, this relationship that does exist, gives us a very strong sense of family relations. And again, you have this emotional complexity, this ambivalence that is obvious here. I will just say a few more, just to summarize. I won't talk about the other novels, but I will summarize in brief. In the novel by Krauss and by Englander, these two novels take place mostly in Israel. They're Israeli characters. The connection with Israel is very significant. And there too we can see this duality, this complex stance in which we see criticism on the one hand and a relationship and very strong involvement on the other. Going back to the sociological discourse, I think that what the literature reflects is very far from the distancing discourse, but in the sociological discourse there is also evidence of this perspective, of this new involvement in Israel. I won't go into the names of the scholars. There's Sasson, for example, who talks about the new engagement to Israel, and he outlines something that's very similar to what we see in the literature, meaning the connection with Israel is different, it's new. We see more involvement, more engagement, more interest, and through that interest and engagement, there is criticism, meaning we have to be more tolerant of criticism because it's part of the change and part of the engagement. I began with a literary comment, and I'll end with one. Compared to previous generations, Philip Roth and other authors, is related to this change in engagement with Israel. This wave of writing about Israel demonstrates a new type of relationship with Israel. Israel is no longer a station along the way on the journey of seeking American Jewish identity. You talked about from Jerusalem and back. To Jerusalem and back is not coincidental. The movement is towards Jerusalem as part of a journey. It's a station because it's a very American journey. It's an internal American journey. The younger generation can see Israel as a separate entity. It stands alone. And this leaves more room for criticism on the one hand, but on the other hand, it creates a stronger and more intimate relationship, a different type of engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gitit Levi-Paz. I hope that the literary intimacy will impact the sociological intimacy. Now we're going back to the spiritual father of these younger writers, Philip Roth. Like Professor Roski's, I'm going to be giving you my own story, the autobiography. I'll be speaking in English. Philip Roth wrote in English, so I think I can do that. And then we'll go back to Hebrew. So the speaker is now switching to English. My life with Philip Roth.
Philip Roth's first Yortzeit is approaching, the Shiri says. Also another anniversary, the 5th anniversary of his receiving an honorary doctorate from the Jewish Theological Seminary. That ironic moment in the iconic writer's life, and both of those events form the backdrop for these remarks. I've lived with Philip Roth most of my life. though I've never met him. I almost met him once, just a few years ago, in a bagel shop on Amsterdam Avenue, just below 79th Street in New York City, but that's another story. Mostly, though, I've lived with him the way most of us live with authors, through the most intimate of intimate relationships, through reading. When we read an author's books, we get to know him, not perhaps those superficial details, what kind of bagels he prefers, what he likes smeared on them, but something else, that impalpable something revealed through plots and characters, through allusion and metaphor, through the very cadence of his prose, the texture of his vision of the world, the quality of his mind and heart, what we used to refer to as his soul. As I've said, I've lived with Philip Roth most of my life, but our relationship has little to do with the facts of his life. Our relationship has more to do with the facts of my life. I first met Roth in 1969, which is to say I began reading Roth in 1969. I was 17 years old, a junior in Yeshiva High School in Brooklyn. I was a good boy, a yeshiva bacher. I rarely fought with my parents. I did well in school. Even the principal liked me, which was something of an embarrassment. But while I was a good boy, I was 17, and it was 1969, the year of Woodstock, of sex and drugs and rock and roll, of which I was familiar with at least one. America was bombing Cambodia, and the anti-war movement was gaining steam. Neil Armstrong took one small step for man, a giant leap for mankind, and Philip Roth published Portnoy's Complaint. Revolution was in the air, and in my timid, hormone-sotted way, I breathed it in. Nicole Krauss has said that she read Portnoy's Complaint when she was 12, and that her mother had given it to her. That could never have happened in the working-class home I grew up in, where my father read the newspaper until he started snoring under it, and my mother read, she read whatever I gave her to read. I was a bookish kid. I remember writing doggerel when I was 10, but I had no real guidance. I read whatever caught my eye in the library, sports books, mysteries. In high school, I was trained in Bible and Talmud and Hebrew and something called Jewish philosophy, and also in math and science and history, and yes, literature. Needless to say, however, Philip Roth was not on the literature syllabus. I didn't even know who Philip Roth was until one day in Jewish philosophy class. It was not really a class in Jewish philosophy. It was more like a chapel requirement, a feeble attempt to prepare us with platitudes for the bourgeois respectability of Orthodox Jewish manhood, which is where we were all headed in any case, most of us. It was taught by a rabbi, a good man, no doubt, a learned man, but one wholly unsuited to the task and the times. He was short, bespectacled, with a funny mustache, and not one of us took him seriously. One day, he took it upon himself to warn us about a dangerous, self-hating Jew named Philip Roth, who had just published a very evil book called Portnoy's Complaint. A book, I see you've all read it, a book offensive to all that was good and holy, to God and Judaism, to the victims of the Holocaust, to Jewish mothers and fathers, a book full of schmutz and shiksas, full of onanism and orgies, a book that was definitely not good for the Jews, a book that would no doubt bring down the wrath of God upon any Jew who would dare read it, and the fury of the Goyim upon all Jews, whether they read it or not. I'm paraphrasing, of course, filling in the gaps in my memory with the criticisms that hounded Roth ever since he started publishing the stories in what would become his first book, Goodbye Columbus. Still, while I don't remember his exact words, this is unquestionably the ignorable gist of what he said. What is remarkable about the harangue, however, is that I do remember part of it very distinctly. I remember with great clarity one of the words the rabbi used in his harangue, a single word whose use stunned me so that the memory has stayed with me half a century. The word is orgies. But he didn't say it that way. He said orgies. Orgies. And I remember thinking to myself, he doesn't know how to pronounce the word orgies. He purports to be an expert on sex and literature. We're supposed to take his warnings seriously, and he doesn't know how to pronounce the word orgies. What else doesn't he know? Now, don't ask how I knew how to pronounce the word, but apparently I did. And no doubt, I should have appreciated the rabbi more for his unfamiliarity with the word well beyond his ken, but I didn't. In any case, the rabbi had been unmasked, and the last modicum of authority that poor man had over us went flaccid at that unfortunate mispronounced moment. Schmutz and shiksas, onanism and orgies, a more enticing review could not have been written. One of my classmates soon got hold of the book that we were not supposed to read, and it made the rounds, passed from hand to sweaty hand, and my life with Philip Roth commenced. I read the book in a fever. Turns out the rabbi was right, at least about the schmutz. Some of it eye-opening, some of it repulsive, all of it outrageous and hilarious. But however titillating and offensive and funny and frightening to a 17-year-old yeshiva boy in Brooklyn, I knew even then that the schmutz was not the point, that something else was going on. Through the hormonal miasma of my youth, I could see that Alexander Portnoy had what to complain about, that he had a problem, that he was deeply, deeply unhappy, that the book was not an orgiastic celebration, but a painful rant on a psychiatrist's couch. Had the rabbi and I read the same book? Had the rabbi read it at all? Through a glass darkly, I understood then, though I hardly would have been able to articulate it this way, that the schmutz was a symptom of a disease called assimilation, of an almost bankrupt Jewish community that had embraced the idea of America with such passion that it was rapidly losing its ability to hold on to its members. No Rothian pun intended. Portnoy's parents, grow up. Portnoy's parents embraced the idea of America, American culture, movies, music, sports. Their heroes were American heroes, their values, American values. At the same time, their Judaism was being emptied of its content. They kept kosher at home, but had no problem with the pork at the Chinese restaurant. They worked on Saturdays, but could not fathom not wearing a suit on Rosh Hashanah. They dreamed the American dream, but were haunted by anti-Semitism and by their own sense of difference, of chosenness. They embraced America, but were wary of Americans, of Christian Americans, those below them, those above them, those beyond them. And they held tightly onto the taboo of intermarriage. Beyond the schmutz, this is what caught my attention. Later on, much later on, after I became a scholar, I found out that Roth's mind had been percolating with these ideas for some time, especially in the years preceding the writing and publication of Portnoy's complaint. At a symposium on the Jewish intellectual and Jewish identity held here in Jerusalem in 1963, he offered this assessment of American Jews. What a Jew wants and how he goes after it does not, on the whole, appear to differ radically from what his Gentile neighbor wants and how he goes after it. How can Jews define Jewish peoplehood when, quote, there is no body of law, no body of learning, and no language, finally, no Lord? There was anti-Semitism, but the dying away of anti-Semitism in our country, that is in the United States, its gradual ineffectiveness as a threat to our economic and political rights, further disobliged Jews from identifying themselves as Jews. It seems to me, he explained, that the Jews say this to the Gentiles, if only by their existence. We do not believe what you believe. We may believe nothing. We may all believe something different, but we just cannot swallow the central fantasy of Christianity, the fantasy of one woman having a child without first having the pleasure of intercourse. What Jews had inherited, what distinguished them, besides their rejection of the Christian mythology, was a vestige of Jewish culture and history, a way of thinking about themselves that Roth said could be translated into 3 words: Jews are better. It was, however, a psychology, he said, without content. His interest in the peculiar, seemingly untenable position of the Jews in America goes back even further, to one of his earliest short stories called The Conversion of the Jews. In that story, a fatherless, pre-adolescent Jewish boy named Ozzie Friedman frustrates and angers his afternoon Hebrew school teacher, Roth calls him Rabbi Binder, by asking naive but difficult questions. One day, when the rabbi tries to explain to the boys that Jesus could not have been the product of a virgin birth because he was, quote, historical, Ozzie says, if God could create the entire world, especially the light, why could he not cause a woman to have a baby without intercourse? Rabbi Binder had no answer for him and summons his mother for a meeting. Roth continues, what Ozzie wanted to know was always different. The first time he had wanted to know what Rabbi Binder could call the chosen people, if the Declaration of Independence claimed all men to be created equal. Right. Professor Eisen knows about this. Rabbi Binder tried to distinguish for him between political equality and spiritual legitimacy, but what Ozzie wanted to know, he insisted vehemently, was different. This was the first time his mother had to come. What Ozzie wanted to know was different. What Alexander Portnoy wanted to know was different. They wanted to know what afternoon Hebrew school was ill-equipped to explain because it too was the product of the same nexus of inextricable contradictions. At the end of a later novel called Deception, his ex-lover tells the character called Philip Roth, well, I happen to know that whenever you feel agitated and ambivalent, then you do indeed have something to write about. Well, Roth comes back again and again to the afternoon school at the end of the anatomy lesson in a piece called Looking at Kafka, where he imagines that Franz Kafka survives tuberculosis and Hitler and escapes to America, where he becomes young Philip's Hebrew teacher and comes to his house for Shabbat dinner. And in Operation Shylock, which takes place almost wholly here in Jerusalem during the First Intifada and the Demjanjuk trial. In that novel, written nearly 4 decades after the conversion of the Jews, the character called Philip Roth, there are 2 Philip Roths in the novel, finds himself kidnapped and left in a classroom somewhere that reminds him of his afternoon Hebrew school classroom. On the blackboard are written these words, which he says he cannot read. Vayivater Yaakov levado, vayevek ishimo ad alot hashachar. The Roth character reflects, I was thinking that whatever it was that was happening to me, being kidnapped, being left in the room, had all begun back when I'd first taken my seat in that small, ill-ventilated classroom that was the Newark original of this makeshift Jerusalem replica, during those darkening hours when I could barely bring myself to pay attention after a full day in the school where my heart was somehow always light, the public school, from which I understood clearly every day in 1,000 ways my real future was to arise. But how could anything come of going to Hebrew school? The new generation of Jewish kids in America were different. The character continues, speaking and thinking American English, only American English, with all the apostasy that was bound to beget, concluding that the cryptography on the blackboard, whose signification I could no longer decode, had marked me indelibly 4 decades ago out of the inscrutable words. Out of the inscrutable words had evolved every English word I had ever written. Yes, all and everything had originated there. All and everything had originated there. Alexander Portnoy had originated there. He grew up saturated with an impossible, unsustainable ambivalence, drowning in it, bullied by it. His longing for America, to be an American, to realize that dream of freedom unencumbered by the vestigial heft of Jewish history, that longing is perverted into a desire for an obsession with American women, with shiksas. He says so much to his psychiatrist. What I'm saying, doctor, is that I don't seem to shtup these, I'm changing the words to make it cleaner than the original. I don't seem to shtup these girls as much as I shtup their backgrounds, as though through fornication I will discover America, conquer America. Maybe that's more like it. Columbus, Captain Smith, Governor Winthrop, General Washington, now Portnoy. As though my manifest destiny is to seduce a girl from each of the 48 states. 48 states. This is hardly a new trope in American writing, I later learned, though Roth takes it to new heights or lows. But here's the Rothian rub. Portnoy can't sustain a relationship with any of them. He is stalked and stymied by thoughts of his parents, by his old neighborhood, but the all but empty Jewishness that nevertheless gave warmth and flavor and meaning to their lives. All this holds poor Alex tenaciously to its bosom, all this Alex holds tenaciously to his. For all Portnoy's sexual conquests in America, however, the episode that struck me most then, the one that stayed with me for decades, was when towards the end of the novel, in a last-ditch effort to save himself from himself, to make a man of himself, whole and in control, Portnoy comes to Israel to immerse himself in a sea of Jewishness. Like many American Jews, he is overwhelmed as soon as he lands at the airport. The writing on the walls is Jewish, Jewish graffiti. The flag is Jewish, returned. This is where it all began. Just been away on a long vacation, that's all. Here, we're the WASPs. The taxi drivers are Jewish. The policemen are Jewish. At the hotel, I asked the clerk for a room. He has a thin mustache and speaks English as though he were Ronald Coleman, yet he is Jewish too. And on and on. But then he turns to Israeli women. He meets at the beach a chayelet with, quote, green eyes and tawny skin, as sleek as a seal in the water. They have a few beers. The beers are also Jewish. And he invites her to his hotel room where, much to his chagrin, he cannot perform. Impotent in the promised land. Next, he meets an idealistic kibbutznikit, a hardy, red-headed, freckled, ideological hunk of a girl, the child of American Olim from Philadelphia. I won't go into details, but it was, in Portnoy's words, his final downfall and humiliation. You should go home, the girl says to him. You should go home. Dimly, the 17-year-old yeshiva boy understood that, as schmutzy as the novel was, Philip Roth was on to something. Jack and Sophie Portnoy may not have been modeled on Roth's own parents. They certainly were not like my parents, but they were real. I knew these people, nice people, good people, likable people. And in my adolescent intolerance, I looked down upon them and their milquetoast American Judaism. Poor Alexander Portnoy, what chance did he have? On one hand, America the beautiful, America the desirable. On the other hand, Jewish guilt, nothing more. Had he only known real Judaism, real religion, real Zionism, impotent in the promised land, could it have been any clearer? Could my little mustached rabbi, who looked and sounded nothing like Ronald Coleman, could he have been more wrong? Portnoy's complaint should not have been burnt at the stake. It should be required reading. It was not an abomination. It was the holy of holies. How easy to be arrogant then at 17 in 1969. I've lived with Philip Roth all my life since then. Professionally, I've taught him, I've written about him, but mostly I've read him and read him and read him. Like good friends sometimes do, we've drifted apart only to renew our friendship later in life. Sometimes our paths crossed at just the right moment. I read Patrimony, his memoir about his father's illness and death, when I was in New York caring for my ailing father. I read it on the subway and could not hold back the tears. I never felt closer to him, to Roth and to my father. Over the years, I've liked some of his books more than others, but now, having faced the innumerable nemeses one encounters, even in an unremarkable life like my own, the limits of strength and talent of wisdom, the recalcitrance of failure and infirmity, the grim realization that you are not alone in plotting your life, I read him now with a kind of calm, melancholy joy. I no longer feel the certainty I once did about the etiology of Portnoy's complaint, and certainly not about the cure, and I still smile with ironic satisfaction when I think of the honorary doctorate from JTS. How different the beginning of his career from its end. Whoever would have guessed? Yehi Zichro Baruch.
תודה רבה לפרופסור קרמר על
Thank you, Professor Kramer,
ההספד וגם, אתה יודע,
for the
פרשנות כל כך
Hesped and
יפה,
for this
שון
beautiful
המילים.
interpretation.
מה מעיק על פורטנוי,
Now we
מה העיק על
understand
פיליפ רוט,
Portnoy's
וכנראה על עוד
complaint and
הרבה,
Philip Roth's
יהודים,
complaint,
באמריקה,
and that apparently
הזה
of
להיות
many
יותר
American
אמריקאי
Jews
מאמריקאי,
wanting to be more American than the
גם יותר
Americans
יהודי מיהודי.
and more Jewish than Jewish.
רק הערה קטנה.
I have one
דיברנו על
comment.
הספרות הישראלית ואיך היא מגיבה
We haven't
להפצה.
spoken about Israeli literature and its reaction to its twin
גם הם מפיליפ רוט.
across the Atlantic.
אסף גברון,
Asaf
שכותב
Gavron is
פה
influenced
רומנים
by
עם
Philip
הבוטות
Roth.
והנועזות
He
והחדות
has the
הפיליפ-רוטית
boldness and
עם
sometimes
כל
the
הנוירוטים,
coarseness
כל
with the
הנושאים
neuroses
במיניות.
and the
ממש רואים את
sexuality
ההשפעות
of Philip Roth. You
עליו,
can
של פיליפ רוט עליו.
easily
יש
discern
הרבה מאוד,
the Rothian impact.
סופר מתן חרמוני כתב שני
Matan
רומנים
Harmony
שהם בעברית,
wrote
הם
two
מתרחשים.
novels.
אחד מהם מתרחש בניו יורק,
One
Hebrew
is
Publishing
in New
Company,
York, the Hebrew
על
Publishing
ספרות
Company,
השון.
on Yiddish
הגיבור שלו הוא
literature.
גיבור שהוא מין תערובת
The
דם,
protagonist
פיליפ-רוטית, סול
is
בלויט
a kind of
ובשבי
figure,
זינגרית.
character
זה
that
מתן
is Philip
חרמוני,
Roth,
שכל
Saul
המוזיקה
Bellow,
של השפה שלו
rolled
היא
into
מוזיקה
one.
של ספרות יידיש.
And that novel has the music of Yiddish literature. Other novelists, Israelis, like Edgar Keret and Gary Steingart, they're all friends, Israelis and Americans, the younger generation. Nicole Krauss, for example, if you read Pinchas Sadeh and Amos Oz, she read them. In other words, she read Israeli literature and it influenced her. The previous generation of Israeli writers influenced the younger American writers. Now we turn to Israeli literature, and I'd like to call on Yochi Brandes to tell us about her own writing. And I'll be asking you why you chose these particular topics. Yochi's earlier novels, Yochi was born to a Hasidic family in Haifa. She knows that world. She learned in she studied in Haredi school. She went to Bes Yaakov. She taught Tanakh for many years. Her earlier novels addressed the larger questions of Zionism. Her novel Melachim Gimel addressed topical, timely Israeli issues of the here and now. Pardes Shel Akiva deals with Rabbi Akiva, and Adele is her recent novel, giving the Baal Shem Tov's perspective from his daughter's perspective. Good evening. Yes, I grew up in the Haredi world, in the Hasidic world. My family was a family of Admorim, the Hasidic leaders. For 250 years, this role has been passed from father to son. All my family were rabbis, Hasidic rabbis. These families tend to intermarry. So I can say that all the Hasidic rabbis in Israel, in the US, and in England are all my cousins or married to my cousins. And I have some older cousins from former generations. I was brought up in this world. I was supposed to marry a Hasidic rabbi, and I was supposed to be a Rebbetzin. That was the role, a very significant and important one. But I didn't stay in the Haredi society. People get good things in Haredi society. I didn't remain there because there's one thing Haredi society does not enable, and obviously I'm talking about freedom. I wanted to make my own decisions. I left Haredi society. I went seeking, and I found friendships, cultures right here in Israel, where it was better for me to live. In the early years, these steps were very slow. In the early years when I left Haredi society, I thought I would never study anything Jewish. I said, enough already. I studied for 12 years in a Haredi school. Then I went to Haredi college for another 3 years. I'm interested in other things. I'm interested in other cultures, history, literature, philosophy, cinema, theater. The more I studied, however, I realized that I wouldn't get anything out of it. Of course, they're interesting, but they don't spark me to do anything. What does that spark mean to me? I'm involved, I'm emotionally involved. The Jewish culture is the only one that turns me on. I love to love it, I love to hate it, I embrace it, I disagree with it. It moves me. Other cultures leave me cold. When I understood that, I knew that's what I wanted to do in my professional life. I wanted to do Jewish things. I took a BA and an MA here in this wonderful place right here. I did my MA here, then I worked here for a few years. I studied Jewish studies, I studied Bible, and I understood that the academic world was not for me. I wasn't cut out to be a scholar, but my academic training gave me so much. I studied at Bar Ilan too, but here at Schechter, I learned so much. When I was studying in the Haredi world, I learned a lot, but I didn't really know. There was no historical dimension. The protagonists of my recent novels, let's take King David from Kings 3, or Rabbi Akiva, the Baal Shem Tov from Adel. When I was in the Haredi school system, I was sure they all lived pretty much the same time. They spoke to each other, they were friends, they were at Mount Sinai together. Well, of course, they're all historical, but it was only after I finished my academic degree I had a historical sense how our culture impacted other cultures but was also influenced by them. I learned all that here. When my thoughts took on this understanding, I realized that I wanted to deal with Jewish subjects. I do many things. My real profession, and I have a diploma, I'm a teacher of Bible. I've taught in secular schools, religious schools, Masorti schools, not Haredi schools. But in all the different streams of Israeli society, I've taught. Somebody told me I taught her son in a Masorti school. I also taught teachers in a teacher's college. And I'm still in the media, radio, television, newspapers, always on Jewish subjects. And I started writing novels 20 years ago. When I first decided to write Judaism as prose, I realized that I wanted to write fiction. The minute I decided to write, I knew I would be writing fiction, writing Judaism. Shiri, you said that my early novels are about Zionism. That's true, because I wasn't bold enough I didn't dare write about Jewish historical figures. I thought that first I needed to delve into their personality. I don't want to write about heroes. That's not fiction. Write about martyrs. I needed to delve into their personality. What are their weak spots? I wanted to write about their desires, their loves, their hates, their feelings, their emotions, and I didn't dare do that. How could I turn Rabbi Akiva, Baal Shem Tov, Miriam, Moshe Rabbeinu, King David into human beings? So I did that in my earlier novels to the founding fathers of Zionism. That's relevant to our lives. It's much easier to do that, to turn Zionism into literature. It was easier for me than to turn classic Judaism into literature. Only after 5 books in 3 Kings could I finally write about Jewish figures. I've written 10 books, a play, I'm writing a film script now, everything revolving around Jewish culture. I want to talk a little bit about my development as a writer. All these trends are related to Judaism. When I speak about trends, I mean that I am not objective. I have an agenda. Some writers say, I just want to write good books. And people ask him, what's your agenda? Many writers will be insulted if you ask them. But I'm proud of it. That's my agenda. I have an agenda as a writer. Of course, I want to write good literature. I want it to be the best that I can produce. But I do have extra literary agendas. As I said, I have set myself the goal of taking the complex, unfamiliar Jewish tradition. This is what is so sad in Israeli culture. In our Israeli culture in secular schools, people study just a tiny bit of Bible. We have a course called Me'atanach ad Palmach, Tanakh to Palmach, and they simply ignore Jewish tradition of generations, of hundreds of years. And it became my goal to turn generations of Jewish history into fiction, so that any person who can pick up a book and read it will find an interest, even if he or she know nothing about the subject, even if they have never read about it or studied about it. It was my goal that a person should be able to read my book and learn new things about Israeli and Jewish culture. Unfortunately, we don't write for the masses. Maybe the movie will attract more people. I do have a good reading base, but we're not talking about the masses. We're talking about intelligent people, the reading public. I want people to be able to read my books because they're interesting and they'll be able to learn something. When people ask me about myself, I start telling them, read the book slowly, read the book about Rabbi Akiva slowly, it will take you a few days, read it slowly. I know that any reading person, any intelligent person, even without any previous background, can enjoy my books and learn something from them. That's my first goal, but it's not the only one. Another goal is also very important, and I won't teach and I won't write if I can't achieve this second goal. I still teach, I teach Tanakh. This is the second goal. To give a different kind of perspective on our culture, not to go the usual route. It's my goal that if someone is familiar with Jewish history, this person will say, wait, just a minute, no, that's not what I learned when I was younger. And someone who knows nothing about my book will also be shocked. Somebody will be like, what? Judaism says this? No, no, that's impossible. She's making it up. I want people reading my book to sit bolt upright. Some people say it's subversive. They say that I debunk myths, but I never set out to debunk myths. I decided to give the sacred cows a new lease on life.
מאמינה מאוד.
I'm a
שהתרבות
believer.
שלנו
I
היא תרבות
believe that
רבת
our
גוונים
culture
וצבעים
is multifaceted, multicolored,
ופרשנויות.
multivocal, with different kinds of
לצייר אותה
readings,
ולעשות
different
אותה
interpretations.
ולהכיר אותה.
There are so many
אני
different
יוצאת
things to
מאוד
know.
נגד הגישה שאני
I
גדלתי
oppose
בתוכה.
the way
שקיבלתי
I
הרבה
was
מאוד ממנה,
raised.
אבל אני יוצאת
I
נגד
learned a
הגישה
lot from it,
הבסיסית
but I oppose
שבתוכה
that basic
גדלתי,
approach. I
שלימדה
grew
אותי
up
שיש דרך
with the
אחת
approach
להיות יהודי,
saying that there is
ויש
one
דרך
way and
אחת
one way only
לפרש,
to be a
ויש
Jew,
דרך אחת
one
ללמוד. אני
interpretation,
זוכרת
one
שכילדה
commentary.
קטנה עוד,
I remember
שקראתי
as a
תנ"ך,
child
תמיד
when
אהבתי
I
תנ"ך.
studied
והרבה
Tanakh,
פעמים
when I
הייתי
read Tanakh, I
תלמידה
always
אלימה.
loved the Bible.
אבל
I
תנ"ך
wasn't
מאוד
a good
אהבתי, ואני
student
זוכרת שכשילדה קטנה
besides
של-
that,
קראתי
but
תנ"ך,
I
והיו לי
loved reading the
פירושים
Bible.
מאוד יפים
There were
שהסתדרו לי מהטקסט. אז המורה
all
אמרה,
kinds of
יוכבד,
interpretations,
זה
and the
לא
teacher said to
רש"י.
me, no, Yocheved,
זאת
that's
אומרת,
not
זה לא
written in
רש"י,
Rashi.
לא ולא התנ"ך. כי ללמוד תנ"ך בבית יעקב זה היה להגיד
When you
מה
studied
שרש"י,
in
רש"י.
Bet
אמרת
Yaakov,
רש"י
it
זה
was
אתה, זה
Rashi.
בסדר.
Rashi was
אין
everything.
שום דבר פרט
Rashi was the
לרש"י.
be all and
עכשיו,
end all.
רש"י הוא פרשן ענק.
Of course,
אבל,
Rashi is a
אני שמתי לי למטרה
commentator
לפתוח את נקודות המבט. אני רוצה שהקוראים
of
שלי
the first
יפתחו
order,
להם נקודות
but I
מבט
wanted to study other
חדשות,
things. I
וגם
want
אני
my
מאוד
readers
מאמינה
to
שכשאדם
learn new things.
קורא ספר, נגיד כמו שלי, והוא
When someone
והוא
reads a
פתאום
novel
נתקל
of mine,
בפרשנויות שהוא לא שמע, והוא
when a
אפילו
person
חושב
comes
שזה לא
across
יכול להיות שיש פרשנויות כאלה,
a new
ואז הוא
interpretation,
רץ ובודק
he
אותי,
might
ופותח
think, no, this is
ויקיפדיה,
impossible, so
ובא
he'll
להרצאות, ורואה
look it up,
שהדברים האלה אכן מבוססים על המקורות.
Google it,
זו מטרה מאוד
find
חשובה
out
שלי,
that
אני
I
מבססת
did
את הספרים
use
שלי על המקורות.
the classic
זה יפתח
sources,
לו את
the Jewish
האפשרות
sources.
לפרש אולי בעצמו, לקרוא עוד
That will
פרשנויות.
give
אני מאוד
somebody
מאמינה בכלל שקבעו
interest,
חכמינו,
and
שכל הזמן
I'm
אומרים אותו.
a believer
אומרים את
in
הכלל
the
הזה, אבל לא
saying,
מספיק
people
מבינים
repeat this over
את
and over
העומק
again,
שלו. 70 פנים לתורה.
70 panim לתורה.
איך הארי הקדוש
The
אומר? לא
Torah
רק
has
70 פנים לתורה. הארי
70
הקדוש אומר,
faces,
בעצם הוא אומר
70
600,000
aspects,
פנים
70
לתורה, כי הוא אומר,
facets.
כי כל יהודי ויהודייה, אני מוסיפה
Every
יהודייה,
Jewish person, I'm adding every Jewish woman, not just every Jewish man, can give his or her own interpretation to the Tanakh. The Baal Shem Tov said that.
אבל הבעל שם טוב הולך עם זה.
The Baal Shem
ולכן אני
Tov
מאוד מאוד
took up
מאמינה
this approach.
באלה ואלה דברי אלוהים
I
חיים,
believe
ואני רוצה לפתוח
that
את נקודת המבט. עכשיו, איך אני עושה את
there are
זה?
different
אני הולכת
aspects
למקורות,
of interpretation.
צוללת אליהם, בחושים בלשים שפיתחתי עם
I
השנים,
developed keen
ומוצאת
senses to
סיפורים
read
בעיקר
interpretation.
של
I
קבוצות שהפסידו
delve
את
into the Jewish
ההיסטוריה.
sources,
כי הסיפורים
and
של
I come
הקבוצות
up
שניצחו את
with
ההיסטוריה
fascinating
מוכרים.
stories that escaped
בדרך כלל.
history.
הסיפורים של הקבוצות שהפסידו
I want to write about
בדרך
the
כלל
losers
נשמדו,
in history.
הוחבאו. היום אי
The
אפשר
losers
להשמיד
don't write
סיפורים
history.
בעידן
Today you
האינטרנט,
can't
אבל גם מאז המצאת
delete
הדפוס קשה להשמיד סיפורים.
things
אבל
anymore.
פעם
Stories don't get lost.
כתבו סיפור,
Since
10
the
פעם,
invention
כתב
of
יד,
the
10, 20,
printing
30
press,
פעם,
you
קבוצה
can't
שניצחה,
just
השמידה את הסיפורים של הקבוצה שהפסידה.
destroy the story
אני
of the
צוללת
losers.
לתנ"ך ולספרות
I
חז"ל
delve into the
ולהגות
Bible, into
ולחסידות
rabbinic
ולקבלה,
literature, the
לכל
Talmud,
הרבנים.
Hasidic
מחפשת
literature,
סיפורים
and
של
I look for
קבוצות שהפסידו,
stories of
ועליהם
the
אני בונה
losing
ספריי.
sides.
כי הסיפורים
And
של
I
הקבוצות
write my stories
שהפסידו
about them. Those
מתארים
groups
נקודת
who
מבט
lost
אחרת.
describe
לדוגמה,
a different
בספר מלכים
perspective.
ג' שהזכרתי,
In Three
אני
Kings,
מספרת
my
את
recent
המאבקים
book,
בין שאול לדוד.
I talk about the struggle
אבל
between
אנחנו, כשאנחנו
Saul
לומדים
and
את
David.
הסיפורים,
When
ובמערכת
we read
החינוך
these
הממלכתית
stories,
זה לומדים, לפחות
this
את
is
זה,
what
יש
they
עוד כמה
learn
דברים, את זה
in
לומדים.
school, the official
אז
line.
אנחנו לומדים את זה ומלמדים את זה
We
וקוראים את
learn
זה
it,
ולומדים
we
את זה,
study
לא
it,
רק
we know
בתנ"ך,
about
דרך
it.
הפרשנויות.
We know the
מנקודת המבט
biblical
של
story, we know the
סופרי
interpretation.
בית דוד. למה? כי אנחנו דוד. אנחנו
We
יהודה.
are Yehuda, we are David, the Davidic kingdom. That's why we know that story. I wrote Three Kings from the perspective of the line of Saul. It's a totally different perspective. It's the reverse of the line of King David, of the winners. I want to give you just one example. I don't want to talk in the abstract. What do I mean when I give the line of Saul's interpretation and perspective? Let me give you an example from rabbinic literature. In the Gemara, they ask, why was the line of Saul cut off? He was supposed to continue ruling. Saul was king, God anointed him, he was supposed to continue to be king. Why did his line stop after one generation? I'd expect the rabbis to say, he was a difficult king, a loser, he killed his son. We have all kinds of bad stories about King Saul, no shortage of reasons to dethrone him. David David, of course, and his line say that King Saul was a bad king. Obviously, the victorious side says the other side was bad. But the answer in the Gemara is as follows. Why was his kingdom cut off? Because he was a perfect king. He was perfect. Perfect. So what is this that the rabbis are saying? If he was perfect, what happened? And they say that this teaches us that a leader of Israel can only be appointed if he has dirty secrets, if he has a bag of dirty secrets, a skeleton in his closet. They were familiar with human nature, the rabbis. When they say that, they mean David. We think of other things, but they meant David. The rabbis had a tradition. I call it the Saul tradition. Saul was perfect. David has his dirty secrets. We want a king with dirty secrets. Why? That's an amazing question that I can't go into, but let me just give you a spoiler. The rabbis say, we are not obedient. We are not quiet and obedient. The people of Israel are difficult. We need a leader who can restrain this unruly nation. And we need to be able to say to the leader, we know about you. We need to trust the leader. It's my goal when I write. This is a very important goal for me in my writing, to give voice to the losers in history. We lost. Why do I say we lost? Because till recently, we were living in a patriarchal society, not just Jewish society. Patriarchal society has various academic definitions. I like the simple definition. This world is a man's world, very simple. Women and children, money, silver, gold and silver, leadership, writing, books, all that belongs to men. All women get in a patriarchal world is what God gave them, what nature gave them. We can euphemistically call it. You always use a euphemism when you talk about something bad. People don't like to talk about something bad. What do women get in patriarchal society? You are the queen of the home. That's what Jews say. You have to give birth to the children, don't leave the house. That's all you're allowed to do. That was Jewish society till very recently. This is my point of departure. I say, even in patriarchal society, even in the world of the Bible, women did take part. Women were creative. Women did produce culture. When I write about the revolutions, each book of mine is about a different revolution in Judaism and Jewish history. I always seek out the voices of those women revolutionaries. These are secret, hidden voices. They were not heard. They were not given a voice. They were shut up. They were persecuted. These women worked behind the scenes. They had to scheme to be able to make themselves heard. They had to work behind the scenes. I look behind the scenes, and from these forgotten places in Jewish history, I take these stories and I place them squarely in the center. I wasn't able to call the book in the feminine, queens. I couldn't talk about Rachel's Pardes. We didn't have women rabbis, we only had men rabbis. Brurya was not a rabbi. She was a scholar, that's true. That's an amazing example. Brurya has a story that I want to tell. If a woman does leave her mark on society, that proves that she had to be larger than life. The book about the Baal Shem Tov, my recent book,
לא קראתי לו ישראל, לא קראתי לו בעל שם
the
טוב,
title is
קראתי לו
Adel,
למה? כי אני
not
מגלה,
Israel,
ככל
not
שאני
הבעל
חוקרת
שם
יותר
טוב.
על הבעל שם טוב, אני מגלה,
The more I study
ככל
about
שאני
the Baal
חוקרת
Shem
יותר,
Tov,
אני מגלה שאדל
I realize that
שותפה
Adel
מלאה
is
ליצירת
a partner
תורה של
to
הבעל
his
שם טוב,
study,
שלימים
to his
קוראים לה
movement.
חסידות. אבל הבעל שם
He
טוב היא שותפה
produced
מלאה.
Chassidut.
אפשר להגיד,
She
בלי
was the
הבעל שם, בלי
partner.
אדל,
Without
ספק
Adel,
אם הייתה תורתו של
I
הבעל
don't
שם טוב,
think
ואם
the
הייתה
Baal
ספק
Shem
אם היא הייתה
Tov
שורדת.
could have
עכשיו, כשאני
become
אומרת
as
תורתו של
famous
הבעל
as he
שם
has.
טוב,
When I speak about his
הבעל שם
teachings,
טוב,
the Baal Shem Tov,
היהדות. היהדות לפני הבעל שם טוב, היהדות
you
אחרי
can't
הבעל שם טוב,
compare
זה לא אותה יהדות.
Judaism before him
לא
to
אותה
Judaism
יהדות.
afterwards.
הבעל
It's
שם
a
טוב
totally
חולל,
different
ואני אומרת שאני
Judaism.
כותבת על
The
מהפכות,
Baal
הבעל
Shem
שם
Tov
טוב חולל את המהפכה
was
הדתית
a
הגדולה,
revolutionary.
ביותר החדשה. יש
This
לנו
is
שתי
the
מהפכות
biggest
גדולות
religious
בעצם חדשה
revolution
שהפכו אותנו
in the
למה
modern
שאנחנו לעם
era.
אחר, לעם
We're
לעם
talking
שכמובן
about
עם
two
המסורת, אבל
revolutions
עם
here.
שונה לחלוטין
We're a
בעת
completely
החדשה.
different
המהפכה
people
האחת היא מהפכה
now.
דתית חברתית
The first
כזאת,
religious
שקוראים
social
לה חסידות.
revolution was
זה לא
Hasidism,
מדויק, והמהפכה השנייה היא
and
המהפכה הלאומית.
the second is the national
אז הבעל שם
revolution
טוב
of
חולל מהפכה
Zionism.
ענקית,
Baal
ואני
Shem
מגלה
Tov
שבלי
represents a
אדל,
revolution.
תורתו
Without
ספק אם הייתה,
Adele,
ואם
he
הייתה,
would
הייתה לגמרי
never
שונה.
have reached the
ולכן אני קוראת לספר
stature
אדל.
that
אגב,
he
יש עוד
occupies
סיבה
today.
שאני קוראת לספר
The title
אדל,
of the book
כי
is
התורה של
Adel.
הבעל שם טוב, הוא
Another
לא קרא
reason,
לה חסידות,
he
הוא לא
didn't
המציא
call his
חסידות, הוא לא יצר
theory
חסידות.
Chassidut.
טוב לא
He didn't
יצר
produce
תנועה.
Chassidut.
הבעל
He
שם טוב
didn't
יצר
even lead
תורה.
a movement. He
התנועה
produced
נוצרה אחר כך.
study, Torah
והוא
study.
קרא
The movement came
לתורתו
afterwards.
אש
And he
דת
called his
עולמו.
Torah
הוא אמר על
אש
ספר
דת,
דברים,
the fire
אני באתי להביא
of
אש חדשה בדת
study of
המנוונת.
Judaism. He wanted to
בסוגריים, של עם
rejuvenate
ישראל,
Judaism,
שלהם.
to
אש חדשה
regenerate the
עכשיו אני מגיעה כאן
stultified
דרך אדל, אני
Judaism
סוף
of
סוף
his
רוצה להגיע
time.
למגמה הנוספת שלי.
I
יש לי
want to
הרבה
focus
מגמות, אבל
on
מפאת
another
קוצר הזמן
agenda
אני
of mine.
מדברת
I have
על
many
הבולטות.
agendas.
אמרתי אחת,
talking
להפוך
about
את
the highlights
היהדות
here.
לפרוזה ישראלית עכשווית.
I want to make
השנייה,
Judaism into
תמיד להציג
current
נקודות
Israeli
מבט אחרות,
fiction. I want to
הופכות
present
קרביים, די
different
מזעזעות, אבל שפותחות את היהדות
subversive
לכיוונים רבים.
perspectives.
דבר שלישי,
And
להשמיע ברמה את קולן
I
של
want to
הנשים,
give voice to
כשותפות
women
בתרבות שלנו,
as full partners in our
והמגמה
culture.
הרביעית שהיא מאוד חשובה לי, אולי הכי חשובה,
And the last point is
שמתי לי
perhaps the most
למטרה
important. It is my
להראות
goal
עד כמה
to
היהדות
show
רלוונטית
how
לחיינו.
relevant
זה
Judaism
אחת
is to our
הסכנות
lives today.
הגדולות שאורבות
One
לפתחה
of
של
the
היהדות
dangers we face
בימינו, למרות
today,
שברוך השם, אני גם רואה את זה על פי
though thank God
ברוך השם, ההצלחה של
I say
הספרים שלי,
Baruch
יש
Hashem,
ציבור רחב
my
שמתעניין
books
ביהדות, אבל
have
עדיין אחת הסכנות
a
הגדולות
growing
שאורבות לנו
public,
זה שהרבה אנשים
a growing
חושבים
readership.
שהיהדות לא
Many
רלוונטית.
people
אני
think
מדברת על
that
יהודים
Judaism is simply
ישראלים.
not relevant anymore. I'm
אני
talking
מדברת
about
על הישראלים,
Israelis,
אני באמת לא יודעת
talking
מה
about
קורה
Israelis
בארצות
here and
הברית,
now. I
אני לא
can't
מתמצאת
speak
בעולם הזה.
about
אני
the
מדברת
US.
על
I'm not
הישראלים
familiar with that
שהרבה
world. I'm
הרבה
talking about
אנשים
Israelis.
חיים את היהדות
Many
בעצם,
people
כמו שאמר
who
נכון
do
שמואל
live
רוסנר,
Judaism,
חיים
just as
אותה.
Shmuel
אבל
Rosner said,
ליהדות, כי זה
but
בשבילם
they
משהו
don't want to
מצוות,
have anything to do with Judaism, mitzvot, commandments, Chassidut. The Bible is something that happened here in Eretz Israel, so maybe that they won't throw away. This is a challenge for me. Not everything in Judaism is relevant to our lives, but I do pick topics that are relevant and I make them more relevant as I develop them.
החסידות לא רלוונטית לרוב
Now
האנשים
back to
בעולם.
Adel.
לא רלוונטית.
Hasidism
חצרות
is not
החסידים
relevant to
יודעת,
most
עדיין
people.
בתוכם.
The courtyards of the Hasidim are
יש
not
כמה
relevant.
6-7% בישראל שיגדירו
6
את
or
עצמם
7% here in
כחסידים.
Israel
לרוב האנשים לא
of the
רלוונטי.
population perhaps
מה שאני
define
עושה
themselves
בספר,
as
והגעתי
Hasidim.
לזה לאט
Others,
לאט
for others it's
במהלך
irrelevant, it's not important. In
תחקיר
this
ארוך,
book,
כי אני בהתחלה
for this
חשבתי,
book I did a lot of
כשהתחלתי לחקור על הבעל
research.
שם
When I
טוב,
started researching the
אמרתי
Baal Shem
לעצמי,
Tov,
אני
I said to
מכירה את התורה
myself,
שלו.
I
נראה
know
מה- איך
his
אני- נראה מה
work.
אני עושה איתה, אבל
What
אני
can I
מכירה
do
אותה,
with it?
גדלתי
I'm
איתה.
familiar with it.
אני
I
יודעת
grew
מה זה
up
תורתו
on
של הבן שלי, אני באה
Hasidism.
מהעולם הזה.
I was
וככל
born into
שאני
that.
חוקרת יותר את תורתו, אני מגלה
And the more I
איזה
study
הבדלים
his
ענקיים
life and
יש
times,
בין מה שהבעל שם טוב אמר
I see the vast
והחסידות
differences
בימינו, ולא רק
between
בימינו,
what he
בדורי
said,
דורות.
what he thought,
אפשר
what
להגיד
he
שבהרבה
wrote,
דברים
and
החסידים
Hasidism
עושים דברים
today.
נפלאים. אני לא באה כאן לשפוט
The
אף
Hasidim
אחד,
do
ומי שטוב
wonderful
לו להיות
things. I'm
חסיד,
not
שיישאר
trying to
חסיד
be
וזה
judgmental.
נהדר.
If somebody wants
חלק
to live that
מהאנשים
kind of
אוהבים
life,
להיות
it's
יותר
fine.
חסידים,
Some
והכל
of
טוב.
the best
אבל הם
people
לא- אבל
I
החסידות
can
כפי שהיא
mention
לא רלוונטית.
are Hasidim, but it's not relevant for most Israelis. But his actual work, his actual writing, his actual thought has changed drastically over the years, and people who try to represent him misrepresent him. His work is relevant to our life. His work is relevant. In fact, it has influenced us. It is continuing to influence us. In this novel, Adele, I try to breathe new life into the Baal Shem Tov's work. I can't just write that he woke up one morning and produced an entire philosophy. I have to show how difficult it was for him, the vicissitudes in his life. He had terrible, terrible problems. Terrible things happened to him. Usually he's portrayed as a holy man. Out of the 20 articles of his work, I can talk about maybe one or two to try to prove to you how relevant his work is to our lives here and now. The Besht says one important thing. The Baal Shem Tov created a social revolution on an immense scale. Up to then, there were elites. There were no middle classes. There were elites. This is in the pre-modern era. And 95 people were just simple Jews. The elite were the poskim, the rabbis, the scholars. Then there were the wealthy Jews who funded the yeshivot and took the best scholars as sons-in-laws for their daughters. 95% of the Jews were simple folk, workers, laborers, shoemen, cobblers, barely literate, tailors, the simplest people of all. And they always feel guilty because the scholars and the rabbis always said the pogroms are because of you, the blood libels because of you. You don't observe the mitzvot seriously. You don't do it right. You don't learn. You don't study. You don't pray in the synagogue. It wasn't bad enough that these poor Jews were literally poor, poverty-stricken. There was anti-Semitism in the 18th century. Their lives were hard in Eastern Europe in the 18th century. On top of that, they were given a guilt complex because of the scholars and rabbis. The Baal Shem Tov reversed all this. He said that whatever you feel in your heart is the most important thing. He taught the simple Jews that anything you do, even if you whistle in the synagogue, that's the most important thing. It doesn't matter how much you study. What matters is to be joyful, to be loving. We don't even realize how influential his work has been for our lives. Before him, rabbis believed, probably influenced by Christianity, in a divide between the soul and the flesh. They tried to denigrate the flesh. They were ascetics. They said, suffer, make yourself hungry and don't sleep. The more you suffer, the better. And the Baal Shem Tov said the opposite. Body and soul are one entity. You serve God not only by praying, not only from the Siddur, not only by studying, not only by observing the commandments. To serve God is to enjoy life, to take pleasure in life, to drink alcohol, to smoke. It wasn't a health issue then. To have sexual relations. The rabbis said that for halachic purposes, but the Besht said it to sing, to dance, enjoy yourselves. This was revolutionary. It had a dramatic impact on Jewish life. After so many years and generations of suffering in the Hasidic courtyards, they are becoming ascetics again. There's a new trend of asceticism. I need one more minute.
לסיום אני רוצה להגיד דבר נוסף שהבעל שם טוב
In
מלמד
conclusion, I
אותנו
want to
וכל כך
say, talk
רלוונטי
about something
לחיינו,
else that Baal Shem
אחת
Tov
הסיבות
taught us,
שהיה
and
כל
it's
כך
so
חשוב
relevant
לי
to our
לכתוב את
lives. And
הספר הזה,
one
להראות
of
את
the reasons that was
הרלוונטיות.
so important for me to
הבעל
write
שם
this
טוב,
book and present the
הבעל שם
relevance,
טוב
Baal Shem
בעצם
Tov
מקדים את זמנו בעניין
preceded his
האינדיבידואליזם.
time
הוא הרבה
when it
לפני
comes to
פרויד.
individualism. He
עד הבעל
was
שם טוב
much
אנחנו
earlier
יודעים
than Freud.
שכולנו צריכים
Before Baal Shem
ללכת
Tov, we know that we all
באותו דבר
we knew that we all
כולם
had to
צריכים
go
להיות. אם
work in the
נולדת
same
חייט,
way.
תהיה
If you were
חייט,
born
אם
a
אתה בן
tailor, you would
רבנים,
be a
תהיה
tailor.
בן
If you
רב,
were the son of a
צריך
rabbi, you would
להתלבש
be a
באותו
rabbi.
האופן
You have to
ולחיות
dress
באותו
in the
האופן.
same manner. You
בא
have to
בעל
live
שם
in the
טוב
same
ולמד
style.
אותנו
And Baal
שהגאולה
Shem
של
Tov
האדם
comes
היא
to teach
גאולה
us that the
אישית,
redemption of a person is a
שלכל
personal
אחד יש
redemption,
נשמה אחרת,
that
כמו
each
שהזכרתי
individual
קודם
has in its
את הארון,
own
ושאף
soul,
אחד לא צריך להיות כמו
and that
מישהו
no one
אחר.
has to be just like
איך הוא
anyone
מסביר
else.
לכל
How does
אחד?
he
בעל שם טוב
explain it? Baal
היה
Shem Tov
אומן
was
בלקחת
an
פסוקים
master
להם
at
פרשנות
taking
שקשורה
verses and
לחיים
giving them
שלנו,
interpretations that are
לפסיכולוגיה
related to our
שלנו, לנשמה
psychology, to our
אז
lives,
אחד הפרשנויות
to our
הכי
souls.
גדולות
And one of
מפורסמות
the
שלו זה
most
קרבה אל
popular
נפשי גאלה.
and one of his most
קרבה אל
popular
נפשי גאלה, הפסוק
interpretations
הזה
is
שהגיע ללכה
the
דודי,
the soul
הפסוק
comes
הזה
closer and is
שלפי הפשט
redeemed
זה
from Lecha Dodi,
אנחנו פונים
Karvan
לאלוהים
Nafshi Ge'ala.
ואומרים בוא תתקרב
We
אל
approach
הנשמה שלי
God and we
ותגאל
ask
אותי,
God
קרבה
to
אל נפשי
redeem
גאלה.
me through
אומר
my
הבעל
soul.
שם
Baal
טוב,
Shem
לא.
Tov says, no,
קרבה אל
that's not
נפשי
what it means.
גאלה.
Karvan
זה
Nafshi
איך אנחנו
Ge'ala
נגאלים?
means, how are we
מתי
redeemed?
תבוא הגאולה?
When will
מהי
redemption
הגאולה?
come? How are we
כאשר
redeemed? Redemption is
אנחנו כל אחד
when
מאיתנו, כל אחד
each and
ואחת
every one of
מאיתנו
us
יתקרב ויתחבר לנשמה של עצמו.
comes closer as draws themselves closer to their own individual soul. This closeness, this intimacy with our own individual soul is the actual redemption. I want to conclude with a question. I like to talk about relevance, so I usually end my books with a question that will leave my readers with food for thought. So the question that the daughter and granddaughter ask one another is whether Baal Shem Tov succeeded or failed. It's an open question. On the one hand, he was very successful. The fact is that the Litvaks weren't as successful. The Hasidim are still alive and thriving, and the Baal Shem Tov's Torah is taught all the time. But to what extent what we do now as part of the Baal Shem Tov's Torah is actually his original Torah, his genuine teachings. The goal is to teach, my purpose is for people to finish the book and learn from these portions of Jewish history and apply them in their own lives. And the question of whether the Baal Shem Tov was successful or failure is an open question. It depends on us. Thank you. Yochi Brandis, thank you very much. We are approaching the end of the conference, but we do want to leave several minutes for a conversation with our distinguished guests, and I'm sure you have some questions of your own. I saw that each of you made notes during the session, so I want to address a question or two to you. The first question, several months ago, Nicole Krauss visited Israel with her most recent book that took place in Israel, and during the interview that we held with her for the radio, she said, now you, the Israelis, now you are writing the Jewish story. You established a state, and now you are, the reins are in your hands. You, the Israeli writers, the Israeli authors are those that are defining the fate of the Jewish nation. And it's an element of humility, and it left me with a question. It's an open question. What I want to ask you, what do you think? Who is writing the Jewish story now?
התחום שלה.
First of all, I apologize that I didn't hear that interview that you had with Nicole Krauss. It's interesting that she said that. I think that to continue what was said before, there is a very special dialogue today between the American Jewish authors and Israeli authors. And as you mentioned, there are friendly relationships between them. Edgar Kareth, Lingenzer, Asaf Gavron, they're all very close friends. The question is where the Jewish center is. And when I think about this question, I think that there is now a very interesting phenomenon in the literary world and in the Jewish world in general. Amos Oz passed away, Philip Roth passed away, Chaim Guri passed away, Aaron Apfelfeld. These are all Jewish writers, Israeli American, who passed away over the last year. And they were writers who were giants of their time. Their literature represented a generation, an era. Chaim Guri, the generation that established the state of Israel, Amos Oz, the kibbutz generation, his personal journey. There's an overlap between the individual personality and the national history. And these are giants that represented Jewish and Israeli history in their novels. And there is a sense that there's now a vacuum in literature today. When you look at contemporary literature, but younger authors, Amos Oz emphasized that he was passing on the baton, he's passing it on to the next generation, but there's a sense that literature and Jewish culture today is a more niche culture of individuals, of groups, and less of denominations, and not as they represented something much more collective, much warmer and much broader. So to continue your question of whether it's Israel or the United States, it's an existential question. Who will pass it on and in what way? And is it not now more a culture, a group niche culture than a collective culture than as it was before? Anyone who's willing to drive us home, I would be happy to continue this conversation and talk about the new novel by Gubi Namdar that crosses all of the boundaries. And that is the topic of a different conference. I was inspired by Professor Golinkin to continue to 9:15, if you don't mind. Any of you, Yochi or Professor, would anyone like to comment? I feel that I disagree with you, Gitit, and that's fine. That's okay, because we have a culture of debate. I think differently. I think that in the past, the generations of Apfelfeld and Amos Oz and all of these literary giants, Chaim Guri, in these generations, there was something much more closed in their Israeli literature. There were elites. Let's say it clearly, although Apfelfeld doesn't really fall into that category, Amos Oz certainly does. The stereotype of the founders of the Israel state, people from former members of the Palmach, Ashkenazi families, as Israeli as possible, your ability to work and be creative and write, that was much greater. That was the type of literature. Over the years, thank goodness, there's less and less of that niche aspect, because literature and art has been opened to so many different groups and denominations, different sectors. I think that a person like me, an author like me, a woman, it's important to emphasize a woman who came from the ultra-Orthodox world, who's not from a rich Ashkenazi family, and my father was never in the Palmach. My chances of being a successful author several decades ago was zero. And now we see more and more people who are contributing to culture, whether it's music and different ethnicities, the colors, the styles, in literature, in theater, in film. Everything is becoming much more open. 7 years ago, when I was at Habima and I presented my play that takes place in a synagogue and involves songs and prayers, and they said if you had come 20 years ago, we would have thrown you out. What type of suggestion is this? The play in a synagogue? Only the religious are interested in that, but now they're willing to accept it, and it was very successful. It attracted very broad, diverse audiences, and it's not just me. The success of many, many other people. Culture is much broader. I'm very optimistic. I'm very happy. I'm thrilled, and I think that the this love for Jewish culture and learning the expansion of the different types of creativity, I think it's expanding and broadening, and I believe that we have an incredible cultural future ahead of us.
גם הדברים, זה לא מגיע. גם הדברים שעלו פה, למשל.
The issues that came up here, we talked about Shtisel and autonomies, the TV series. There were different topics that were less at the center of cultural discourse. These series about ultra-Orthodox families, which never existed before, Arabs, which were also not part of the mainstream, many different series. We see that's exactly what I'm saying. There's an expansion of the discourse. That's exactly the point. I also want to support the optimistic perspective, but from a different angle. We create this cultural continuity and this approach. The issue of American Jewish literature, we invented it. It came from our internal need, an inner need to express ourselves through literature and create a literary continuity. So there's already a chain that began with Ikan Azarzewski, Henry Roth, and it doesn't matter what they meant and who their target audience was 100 years ago or 80 years ago. Now we have adopted them into our historical into the cultural timeline, and we find interest and are reflected in their works. And then there are generations of young authors that see themselves as opposing this timeline, this continuity. And that's how culture is created. And following what Shmuel Rosner said, as soon as something's translated into Hebrew, the identity of the work changes. It enters a new cultural continuity, and it's read by different eyes, it's perceived differently. From my perspective, it's not important if this generation no longer exists and these great authors have passed away and the great days of Israeli Jewish novels is over, but the Israeli films have taken over, have replaced the Israeli novels, and that's fine. That's certainly possible. Or maybe it's television series. Who would have thought 10 years ago that series in Hebrew would conquer the entire world, and you will be able to see them either in Hebrew or with different adaptations into English on Netflix, and tens of millions of people would see it. The Israeli presence would actually change the world. Who would have predicted that? I'm very optimistic. I have nothing to add, but I do want to ask if you understood what Nicole said, what she meant, Nicole Krauss. I don't quite understand what she said. She's not speaking into the microphone, so I can't quite hear her. I'm sorry. I think that what she was trying to say is that the literary center is in Israel and not in the United States. I think that's what she was trying to say. She's, as an American author, if I understood her correctly, she's talking about the centrality. You're saying that she's waiving her status. If you ask where the center is, from her perspective, the center, the Jewish Literary Center is in Israel. Are there any questions from the audience? In conclusion, last one or two final questions? I'm sorry, I can't hear the question. I will surprise you by saying that the objections, the severe objections to my work at the beginning, you get used to it. I've been in the field for over 20 years. The objections kind of fade out. The objections were not only from the conservative side. It came from the other side as well. Sometimes I say right and left, but not political right and left. On the one hand, the ultra-Orthodox and some of the religious public and even some of the secular population would said, how did you dare? It's terrible to talk that way about King David. That's heretical. You can't speak that way. There were rabbis who made halachic rulings against me, against my books. They were prohibiting my books from forbidding people from reading my books, bringing them into their homes. On the other hand, even today, there are still objections. Now we hear a lot of talk about religiousification. Now I hear that you as if left the ultra-Orthodox world, but you're pushing it in from the back door. You're forcing Judaism on us. Why do you care? Who cares what Rambam says? Maimonides said. What do we care about Rabbi Akiva? Of course I'm being attacked. I was attacked from both directions. It's not a matter of courage. If I would have written against Islam, then I would have had to be courageous. I would have to be very courageous to write anything about Islam, to write anything different about Islam, not against. I write about Judaism. We live in a very open culture. The worst thing that happens is that I get terrible criticism or negative talkbacks. You don't have to be brave to cope with that. So I will now like to thank the Schechter Institute for this fascinating conference, for the opportunity to hear all of these speeches, for our panelists. Thank you very, very much. Thank you to our audience. Good evening.